Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, whichever is appropriate in your time zone. And thank you for joining us at our event, Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. My name is Hisham Salem, and I'm the Associate Director of the Program on Arab Reform and Democracy at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies and the Center for African Studies, both at Stanford University. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, the always brilliant, the always prolific Khalid Mustafa Medani, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University. He is, of course, no stranger to Stanford University, where he previously taught, nor is he a stranger to FSI, where he worked as a researcher and a visiting professor at CSAC. Dr. Medani has published extensively on civil conflict with a special focus on armed conflict in Sudan and Somalia. He is the author of Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, which is the focus of his presentation today and which was published last fall by Cambridge University Press. He is presently completing a very exciting book manuscript on the origins and consequences of Sudan's 2018 popular uprising and the prospects and obstacles for democracy in the country. Dr. Medani's work appeared in Political Science and Politics, the Journal of Democracy, the Journal of North African Studies, and many others. He is a former recipient of Carnegie Scholar in Islam Award from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And last year, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He received his PhD in political science from UC Berkeley not that long ago, and an MA from CCS at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Khalid, it is all you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Hisham. It is a distinct honor to be invited to present at Stanford, even though, of course, it's virtual. Like you said, I'm really honored because, of course, I have longstanding relationship with the university, with FSI, but also CSAC. This presentation that I will be delivering today owes in great part some of the research I conducted in the writing when I was at Stanford and also teaching at Stanford. So the insights from the students at Stanford were really, really important in accomplishing this book, which took a number of years to make, of course, or rather to write. And I really do appreciate the invitation. I also want to thank FSI, of course, and the sponsors for this talk. It's really a great pleasure. I wanted to begin with the cover of my presentation. The book came out in October. I hope that some of you will have a chance to read it if you're interested in globalization, black markets, illicit markets, and extremism. I think that you'll find many of the chapters of interest. If you're interested in the countries that are the subject of this book, Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, and their political economy, I hope too that you will find that of interest to you. The title of the book really encapsulates what the argument of the book is, and I'll be detailing it throughout these remarks. The title is, as you can see here, Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa. And what I began doing when I first began researching is try to trace the relationship between globalization, by which I mean the flow of labor to the Gulf countries from Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, and the influx or inflow of capital from the expatriate remittances, labor remittances of those expatriate Sudanese, Egyptians, and Somalis in domestic politics. So I spent a great deal of time conducting research, of course, in Egypt and Sudan and Somalia. And the overall argument that I should preface these remarks with, I just wanted to be clear, is that I trace globalization, or what we call in political science internationalization, to the expansion of informal markets in all of these different countries. And then at the level of the state and at the level of community, I argue that the emergence of different forms of identity politics, be it Islamist, moderate middle class movements, as in Egypt and Sudan, or ethnic ties or ethnic conflict in Somalia, are crucially determined by the extent to which groups, political coalitions in Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia are able to monopolize these forms of black markets or informal markets that I'll explain in a minute, in ways that control competition and generate possibilities of recruitment into their organization. So this is a political economy perspective that seeks ambitiously, but I hope empirically grounded, to understand the relationship between economic globalization, the expansion of informal markets, different forms of informal markets, and the ways that Egyptians, Sudanese, and Somalis were able to monopolize these markets in ways that benefited their particular recruitment drives, but also their relationship to the state in cases where they contested the state. So this is an overall argument of the book. The outcomes that I'm going to discuss are represented here by these photos. On the left, on my left, you'll see the members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. At the top, you'll see Omar Bashir, the former Islamist authoritarian leader and member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan. And at the bottom, you'll see Imbaba in Cairo, where Islamic militants in the late 1990s and early 2000s mobilized and recruited young men in particular into their extremist organization. So these are in pictorial form the outcomes that I seek to explain. Another aspect of this book that I think may be of interest to those interested in extremism and terrorism in particular is that I trace the socio and economic factors that have to do with the success of militants recruiting young men in particular into the organization. And here the case study is al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya of the 1990s and 2000s. And I spent a great deal of time in that neighborhood in Egypt, conducting a great deal of ethnographic research, tracing the specific social and economic factors that led to the popularity and success of al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya in that period in Egypt, a very important period that I argue in the book really determined and influenced greatly the relationship of the Egyptian state to the Islamist movements to this day. I wanted to begin with the overarching questions just to make sure that we're all on the same page. There are three very large questions that this book tackles or addresses, and it opens with these three questions. I'm not going to be able to detail the answers to all of these, but I did want to flag them for a question, for the period of question and the Q&A. The first is, how popular a force is radical Islamism, and how is it distinguishable from other forms of Islamist activism? One of the objectives and goals of this book and for my research from the very beginning was trying to distinguish between extremist Islamist forms of activism and also moderate or accommodationist forms of activism. In policy circles in particular, there seems to be a blurring of those members or those movements that have a radical or extremist agenda, as opposed to those that have a more moderate or accommodationist perspective or objective rather, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in general terms. And so this is one of the tasks that is very important in terms of the contribution of this book that I hope will be of interest to a number of you. The second question is, I think, at the very heart of the real central contribution of this book. And it has to do with the fact that I discuss in the book that this book is in many ways not necessarily just about the role of Islamist groups, militant or moderate, in these countries, Egypt and Sudan and Somalia, but rather a larger question that I pose here, and that is, when and for what reasons do religious rather than ethnic cleavages serve as the most politically salient source of identification? The reason that this question is a central question in the book is because these are all heterogeneous countries, and it is not self-evident and never has been that Islamism would be the natural or automatic recourse for political mobilization. And so taking into account the diversity of both Islamist identification and ethnic identification. This book really seeks to answer this particular question of why in such heterogeneous countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, do some groups or some members, individuals join Islamist organizations, be they moderate or militant, or ethnic or clan organizations and insurgent groups such as those in Somalia, but also in Sudan. So if I was to say what is the biggest and central takeaway of this book, it really is addressing this larger question of identity politics. Another contribution that I think is I'd like to highlight is that by and large, and not exclusively, of course, much of the literature on Islamist movements, which of course has made such great advances and contributions to understanding of the role of our understanding of the role of religion and politics, rarely in Africa and the Middle East takes globally induced changes seriously as a context for the evolution and dynamics associated with these Islamist and even ethnic movements and organizations. And so what this book does is that it painstakingly, based on many years of research in these countries, painstakingly really links transnational economic linkages, specifically labor remittances and those capital inflows, to domestic politics and politics at the level of community, to unpack the social and economic factors that have given rise to the evolution of these movements, be they in Egypt, Sudan, or Somalia. But what I wanted to do, if you will indulge me, is really to begin these remarks substantively with a proverb, a Somali proverb that really opens up the book. It is one that sets the stage for the entire book, and in a very, I think, interesting way, really shows what this general framework of the book is. Abundance and scarcity, as the Somali proverb goes, are never far apart. The rich and the poor frequent the same houses. This proverb, to me, really encapsulates one of the overarching contributions of this particular book that I hope will be focused on if you do get a chance to read it. And that is that while this proverb, of course, in the Somalia context refers to the very kind of climatic issues and instability associated with climatic change for what is a largely pastoralist society, it also represents the general framework of this book analytically. And that is that I look at the role of economic globalization and particularly exogenous economic shocks in the countries of Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia in ways that can help us understand the context and evolution of these different organizations, Islamist or ethnic organizations, as the case in Somalia. The reason I emphasize this, and as you see here in the chart, here in Mogadishu, you'll see the booming housing market or housing boom in Mogadishu in recent years associated directly with the inflow of labor remittance from Somali expatriates. And of course, in the rural and pastoralist areas of Somalia, here you see the really difficult, austere challenge of economic livelihood in the context of ecological and climatic change, in addition to civil conflict. And whereas this framework of exogenous shock or internationalization has been applied, of course, frequently to understand domestic politics in other countries, particularly advanced industrialized countries, this book really aims to apply the framework of globalization and internationalization within the context of poorer, let's say, for lack of a better term, or less industrialized, less developed countries. This is a central aspect of the contribution of the book in the sense that whereas most of the work on these organizations and movements looks at the local level, this particular book looks at the larger kind of global environment, economic environment associated with transnational linkages with the Gulf countries. And this is because poorer countries like Somalia, as you see here, are actually far more vulnerable to exogenous economic shocks than the advanced industrialized countries. And it's for that reason, I thought it was really crucial that we really address this issue of economic globalization and its relationship to local politics, so to speak. The boom in labor migration in the Arab world in particular, and the Middle East, is not news to any of you listening familiar with the region. In the 1970s and up to the mid-1980s and to the present day, an astronomical boom in labor migration from Arab countries initially, and then of course Asian laborers from Asia, really was so consequential that it not only of course benefited the booming oil economies in the Gulf countries and other oil producing Arab countries such as Libya, but it had very important consequences for domestic politics as well. There is no one in the region, and certainly no one in Egypt, Sudan, or Somalia who's not familiar with this phenomenon or does not have nuclear a family member or an extended family member that has not had an experience in working in the oil producing countries. And so in this particular book, I look at the three labor exporting countries of Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, where millions upon millions of Egyptians, Sudanese, and Somalis benefited or traveled to the Arab oil producing countries in search of employment and a better life and upward mobility. This becomes a really crucial aspect of the Arab world and the Middle East, North Africa as a political economy. And I argue here that it has had really, really central consequences for our understanding of domestic politics, particularly with respect to the political economy of these countries. These countries then, Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia, I thought very quickly I'd like to justify why these countries would be a source of examination in this particular book and in terms of my research. It's not always self-evident that one would compare such disparate countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia. But here in this particular book, I focus very exclusively on the fact that they're all labor exporters. In the 1970s, Sudanese, Egyptians, and Somalis, as I said, traveled in the hundreds of thousands and millions to these Arab oil countries. And prior to the 1970s, if you look at the political economy trajectory of these countries, you'll see that they had very similar political and economic similarities. That is the trajectory of state-led development, one-party rule, authoritarianism, and essentially a political economy that was less than open to international economic forces. This, of course, is the period prior to economic reform and neoliberal economic reforms that began in earnest in the mid-1970s in Egypt and of course the other countries as well. So there are two important justifications, so to speak, to compare these countries. The one, of course, is that they, until the mid-1970s, followed very similar political and economic similarities. And even crucially important here, of course, is that their political economies were changed and altered and shaped by the fact that they all counted labor as the most important source of foreign exchange and revenue outside, of course, domestic production. Another aspect, of course, is that their relationship to the regional oil-producing countries across the Red Sea, but also Libya at the time and also Iraq, was crucial in determining the political and economic trajectories and changes of these countries. And specifically here in the book, I frame it around two very important critical junctures. The first is the boom itself that I spoke about that really had to do with the quadrupling of prices, oil prices in the Arab Gulf countries in 1973, which really changed the entire political economy of these countries, and the recession, the slump in oil prices in the mid-1970s that really led to two important, of course, developments. One, of course, was the shrinkage of these capital inflows of labor remittances from expatriate workers. And the other was crucially important, and that is the coincidence or the simultaneous imposition of economic reforms. These two elements were similar in all of these countries. That is the boom where labor remittances played such an important role in foreign exchange revenues, and the bust in which the shrinkage of labor remittances played a very important role in initiating economic reform and necessitating it, in addition to the important fact of reforming economies to try to attract Arab Gulf investment. So I thought I would show a very kind of hopefully useful kind of illustration of the important elements associated with the comparison of these three countries in ways that highlight the explanatory variable that is the focus of the book itself in terms of the overarching concept, and also to explain why these countries witnessed such different outcomes, despite the fact that they all had followed similar political economic trajectories before the oil boom. The most important concept here that I use in the book is the notion of the parallel market. These are privately controlled labor remittances, and as I'll show in a minute, they're very, very important to our understanding of the political economy of these countries. These are essentially labor remittances that go into or inflow into these countries through decentralized and unregulated banking systems. And as such, of course, they have a great deal of influence in the expansion of informal economic activity. Egypt recently, just figures for Egypt alone shows that upwards of 40% of Egyptians actually make their livelihoods in the informal economy. This is just an example. But in addition to that, in order to explain these admittedly ambitious political outcomes in the three countries, I look very carefully at three different factors that really help us understand why this particular these processes of capital inflow as a result of outmigration led to such different outcomes in these countries. And here I focus, as I said, on the state capacity, variations in state capacity of Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia to actually regulate the financial flows incoming, and also to implement repressive measures in those cases where they found a great deal of opposition in civil society. So one of the important differences in all three countries, which are maybe intuitive, is that Egypt, of course, was the country and continues to be with the greatest capacity to regulate these financial flows and the national economy in general. Sudan following that with a weaker capacity to do so, and Somalia with the weakest capacity to regulate the economy. But another aspect that I mention and discuss in detail in the book are the social and cultural differences of these countries. Excuse me. When you look at the kind of these countries at the level of local community, there are also very important changes. Social cultural cleavages based on religious and sectarian differences that I outline in the book, but also very importantly, structural economic differences and cleavages with, for example, Egypt having industrial, commercial, and agrarian sectors that continue to be strong, with Sudan mainly a political economy that is based on agriculture and commerce, but not so much industry, and Somalia being very quite distinct in the fact that it counts pastoralism and agro-pastoralism as the most important and paramount sector in its national economy. These different factors, variations in state capacity, and different social, cultural, and structural economic cleavages help us understand these outcomes that I just discussed. Based on these differences, different factors, in Egypt, following in the boom period, was able to consolidate its rule through implementation of economic reform, and it also saw a period of the rise of Islamist Muslim Brotherhood's strength financially and politically that I'll discuss in a minute, and eventually to the Islamist fragmenting along both militant and moderate lines, as I explain when I conclude this talk. In Sudan, these factors led to different political developments. That is the consolidation of an Islamist authoritarian regime, headed, of course, by Omar al-Bashir, the now ousted former president of Sudan, and over time, the disintegration of the state as a result of changes in the political economy and divisions within the Islamists in Sudan. And finally, Somalia witnessed a very different outcome, and that is the complete disintegration of the state and the onset of interclan conflict in that country. And so the book details in different chapters, I believe there are 7, these different outcomes, both in the boom period that led to specific political developments in all 3 countries, but also crucially the period of recession following the oil slump or the slump in oil prices in the mid-1980s, and the ways that that actually led to a secondary political outcome in all of these 3 countries. Before briefly looking at the cases, one of the important aspects that I wanted to emphasize here, and I hope that it comes out in the book, is reframing or re-understanding, refining our understanding of what we mean by informal markets. And if I was to say what are some of the theoretical analytical contributions here that I welcome questions about, is that when I began this research, the notion that there was a strict separation between the informal and formal seemed to be very much present or ubiquitous in the literature on informal politics. In this particular book, and based on ethnographic research in particular, one of the interventions here is really about the informal economy in two very important ways. One of them is that these informal markets actually are not standalone markets. They're created in social proximity to other forms of markets, which is crucial. Another important takeaway, as you see from the chart, is that they're also crucially dependent or related to the formal market and states. The notion that those embarking in the informal market or who make their livelihood in the informal market are somehow exercising a complete exit option from the formal realm and from the state is something that is not analytically true. And in these particular cases, clearly it obstructs our understanding of how these different identity-based organizations were able to monopolize these markets, oftentimes in contest with the state, but many times in cooperation with states' elites themselves. That is a partnership, so to speak, between those state elites who profit from the parallel market themselves and those in civil society who also engage in the, let's say, the trade in foreign exchange. In this particular book, I highlight three different types of informal market, and I traced their political consequences for identity politics. I thought I would show in a picture form here a Somalian financial black market in Hargeisa, northern Somalia, where here you have Somali shillings traded openly in the black market in that country. So one of the important aspects of this particular book that I trace is the role of the parallel market, labor remittances in particular, that are often denominated in dollars and exchanged for local currency in the domestic markets. I'll explain their role in these countries in a second. And to my right, you'll see the informal settlements of Imbaba. And here we have a different form of informal markets, and that is informal housing that boomed in the context of labor remittances, particularly in Cairo, in Egypt, and informal labor, casual labor that actually represents the most important form of labor in Egypt, not only in informal settlements, but throughout the country. Over 60% of Egyptians actually, working age Egyptians actually enter into the informal labor market rather than the formal labor market. In other words, the consequences of these different forms of markets for politics is crucial and has to be taken into account. There are also illicit economies or illicit markets, many of you are familiar with, that also function in close proximity to labor remittances, the parallel markets, and oftentimes the informal markets in housing and welfare. These include not, of course, tax evasion, but also hostage taking, hoarding of commodities. These are often enabled by other forms of informal markets as well. To talk about the cases themselves or the countries, it'll be difficult for me to detail all of the trajectories that I recount in the book, politically and economically, but I did want to quickly give you an idea of the role of the boom in these countries and how it relates directly to the emergence of different forms of identity politics, Islamist politics, extremist politics, and ethnic politics. In the boom, Egypt and Sudan followed, not surprisingly, similar trajectories in the form of identity politics in many ways. Both countries witnessed in the boom the emergence of very strong Islamist commercial classes that were able to not only contest the state, but in many instances, in the case of Sudan, actually overpower the financial power and political legitimacy of the state. The boom was very important in Egypt. It led to the erosion of the regulatory capacity of the state under Anwar Sadat, as you'll see in the book. The Egyptian government actually liberalized, of course, the economy in 1970s to attract, of course, Arab Gulf investment. But the consequences of that, unintended, was the erosion of the capacity of the Egyptian state to regulate the economy, and particularly its extractive capacity to generate taxes, since much of the labor remittances from Egyptian expatriates evaded official challenge and really landed in the private hands of Egyptians, individuals and households in Egypt themselves. This led, as I trace in the book, to a very important linkage between the Islamist movement, labor remittance traders, and the emergence of an Islamist commercial class that solidified its class basis in economic terms around the commercial sector, whether it be the Sharikat Tawzif al-Amwal in a period of the pyramid schemes in Egypt that many Egyptians are familiar with, or an ill-fated focus on Islamic banking that was eventually curtailed and effectively eliminated by the state. This period also saw two very important outcomes that I trace very closely in the book. The real boom, as I said, in informal housing and informal labor, particularly in the informal settlements in Cairo itself. These were not all, but a very few that I discuss in the book, had very much or witnessed in the late 1990s and early 2000s the popularity of a more militant extremist Egyptian Islamist movement, and is directly related to this period of a boom in informal housing and casual laborers in these areas. For Sudan, rather than erosion, there was a steeper decline of regulatory capacity, and here Islamic banks were far more successful. The Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan were able, as I'll show in a second, to monopolize the Islamic banks in negotiation and with the support of the former dictator Jafar Nimeri. And here too, you saw the emergence of a very strong Islamist bourgeoisie. And for those Sudanese listening today, they know the full kind of consequences today of the emergence of Islamic banking and the monopolization of the Muslim Brotherhood around Islamic financial markets that was central to their evolution, but also to eventually taking over the levers of the state itself. Somalia here represents a very different case. I may not talk about it too much, but it does represent a contrasted case even in the boom period, where Siad Barre, the former dictator, struggled very hard to capture rents or the flow of capital coming from labor remittances unsuccessfully due to a long history of very weak financial institutions that led eventually to the collapse of formal financial institutions completely. This collapse really preceded the collapse of the state and really helps us understand not only the origins and the timing, but the nature of how the Somali state disintegrated to the point where right now, of course, it is in many parts, not all, represented or witnessing conflict along clan lines, even more, as I argue, Islamist or religious lines. And this has to do with the fact that these labor remittances were monopolized by clans, what I call clan-centered economies, rather than by Islamist middle-class members, as in Sudan and Egypt. The recession and aftermath of the 1980s represent the second part of this book. For those of you interested in more contemporary developments, I begin here with Sudan because of the historic revolution of 2018 that came in the wake of the weakening of the Islamist movement in Sudan as a result of something quite intuitive and straightforward, and that is the transformation of Sudan from one dependent on labor remittances to one that was really flush with oil as a result of the discovery and production of oil. In 2011, following the secession of Sudan, the patronage networks that were financed by labor remittances and Islamic banking literally eroded, collapsed, paving the way for the revolution ongoing, as Sudanese like to say. It led first to the disintegration and division of the Islamist movement in Sudan, and following that, of course, the emergence of organizations that upended the Islamist authoritarian regime of Omar Bashir. Somalia here, as you see in the book, if you're interested in clan politics, really represents a different outcome following the recession and in contemporary politics, and that is rather than being really determined by the power of Islamist groups, al-Shabaab notwithstanding, the real political story in Somalia is the way in which clan networks have been mobilized to establish state institutions, particularly in North East Somalia, in Somaliland, in ways that have secured the gains made from labor remittances and the implementation of a tax system that has financed the initial nascent institutions that have stabilized Somaliland as a nascent state, while a conflict between clan networks and militants at Shabaab remains strong in the south. That's only, I would argue, a very small part of the story. Finally, in Baba, Cairo, this, of course, is a period of late 1990s, 2000 in particular, where the rise of militancy was extremely important, in particular areas of Imbaba. I'm going to conclude by talking about that because I feel it's important, and I know that Dr. Hisham is interested. But here, the confluence of the boom in informal housing and informal labor that was so important to employment for young men in this particular part of Imbaba saw all of that dwindle away in the context of economic recession, the increasing unemployment, underemployment, and casual nature of informal labor in this sections of Imbaba in particular led to the exploitation of the state of affairs, the issues of economic precarity, marginalization, was fodder for leaders of the al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya to recruit in particular kind of ways young men into the fold of the more militant organization of al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya itself. I'm not going to go to Sudan, over Sudan's political history too much, but I just wanted to show the importance of remittances for Sudanese economy that continues to represent the most important source of foreign exchange and the most important source of revenue and economic livelihood for the majority of Sudanese. Here you see very usefully, hopefully, from the World Bank, the relationship of remittances to imports, and you can see the boom in the 1970s that goes down very strongly in the mid-1980s with some very erratic, of course, rates over the years. It continues to be an unstable financial market and very politicized in terms of the conflict of both state elites and civil society actors over these informal financial markets. Just very briefly, just to show in the 1980s how important these flows were for Sudan. Here is a survey, one of the few that was conducted in the 1980s. And you can see here that over 80% of these labor remittances from Sudanese expatriates abroad were delivered either through friends or relatives or essentially hand-delivered, making up an enormous amount of the proportion of labor remittances that evaded the state and in many instances over time was captured by traders linked to the Islamist movement in Sudan. This, of course, made possible something that Sudanese know full well, and that is the policy of tamkeen, economic empowerment, and the Islamicization of the national economy, a period in which the Islamist movement in Sudan basically monopolized informal financial markets to build a new state based on Islamist mode of legitimation. This continues to be a bone of contention in Sudan and has determined and is determining political events even as we speak. Key to that is this bank, the Faisal Islamic Bank in Sudan, that was established in Sudan in 1974. It set a model not only for Sudanese Islamists, but Egyptians as well, for the relationship between Islamic banking and Sudanese Islamists themselves. Very quickly, it of course was established in conjunction with Saudi Arabian shareholders and members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan. And thanks to the largesse of the Nimeri, the dictator at the time, because of the leaning towards the Islamist movement and his declining legitimacy, the former dictator Nimeri actually gave special dispensation to the Islamic banks, such as this one, freeing them from taxation, exempting them from taxation and fees, and eliminating any process of auditing of these banks. Long story short, these banks grew phenomenally in comparison to the formal commercial banks. And this is one of the central stories of the financing of the Islamist movement in Sudan. You'll see here throughout the 1970s and until the late 1980s, the growth of the Faisal Islamic Bank in Sudan was phenomenal. In addition to that, it was geared towards urbanites, middle class, in Khartoum itself, in the urban areas, but not to the rest of the country. Here we see a picture of an Islamist movement that consolidates its social class, its urban profile, but also marginalizes in financial terms those living outside of the Khartoum area. This has important consequences, of course, for the protests ongoing in Sudan that begin, the revolution that began in the rural areas and rather than the capital of Khartoum. In addition, I did want to highlight that this was an important source of recruitment for new adherents to the Muslim Brotherhood organization in Sudan. Here you'll see that the majority of lending or the distribution of lending in Sudan was heavily weighted towards the commercial sector, foreign trade, exports and imports, very little to agriculture, which is comparatively the most lucrative in or potentially in Sudan. And here we see not only the consolidation of a middle Islamist commercial class, but also Islamist urbanites that dominated the Islamic banking sector, in addition to the informal financial sector, using these financial flows to recruit members into the organization that are detailed in the book in terms of insisting that members or those individuals who qualify for these loans have a strong relationship and long-standing commitment to the Islamist movement in Sudan. Here we have a story of monopolization of informal financial institutions linked very closely to formal Islamic banking institutions that represent the heyday of financial success and recruitment for the Sudanese Islamist movement. I mentioned the loss of oil and how that led to the erosion of patron networks in Sudan, leading to the downfall of the Islamist authoritarian regimes and the eruption of what we now know as the revolution in Sudan of 2018. But I did want to turn to Egypt. The first chapter in Egypt is entitled, aptly, I think, The House the Boom Built. And this, of course, is the boom, the reference here is to the labor remittance boom associated with the oil boom in the Gulf and other Arab countries, but also the emergence of a very strong Islamist bourgeoisie, a commercial class. By the mid-1980s, remittances continue to play or represent the largest source of foreign exchange. I believe at this point in Egypt, it represents 64 billion annually in foreign exchange to Egypt, outweighing foreign direct investment and foreign aid, although there is a debate around that recently. The remittance boom, of course, as I said, led Anwar Sadat at the time to gradually liberalize the economy, but it also had the unintended consequences of leading to the boom in housing and labor markets. I wanted to just emphasize that just like its Sudanese counterparts, one of the things that I focused on in this book and the research was to look at the rank and file membership of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, rather than the Muslim Brotherhood in their political manifestation or political parties, or even their role in parliament or previous elections. And the reason for that is I wanted to understand the relationship between informal economic relations and markets and the recruitment of members into the Muslim Brotherhood. The basic criteria I found in the working class, or rather lower middle class and middle class neighborhoods of Cairo, is that the basic criteria for membership was an evaluation of siluk, adherence to public morality, and of course, Islamic education. This is nothing new. This is a criteria utilized by Islamist groups worldwide. But the stages of recruitment among the Muslim Brotherhood tell us a great deal about the boom period. As members of the Muslim Brotherhood told me in research, this was al-Ahd al-Dhahabi, the golden age for the Muslim Brotherhood, flush with money as a result of labor remittances and Islam and investment in the commercial enterprises, oftentimes supported, even if indirectly, by the state. The Muslim Brotherhood were able to successfully recruit thousands of young men in particular through a very strict process of tarbiyah, socialization or training, religious education, so to speak, through a number of different stages. I'm going to go over them quickly, but it's important just simply to emphasize for those who may not be familiar that the stages of recruitment are important in two very important elements. Number one, of course, they socialize young members into the Muslim Brotherhood in particular ways and generate commitment in the context of a repressive authoritarian state. But for my purposes as well, they also help explain the identity aspect of these organizations. In other words, these are moderate middle class, so to speak, rank and file members. The stages of recruitment themselves then help to determine why some members would join moderate Islamist movements and why others would join militant organization. These stages of recruitment then help us to explain why some members in Egypt who in general are committed to al-Tayyar al-Islami, the very general Islamist trend, would be recruited into the Muslim Brotherhood rather than a more militant organization. Here you have different stages of recruitment: the general member, devoted aspirant, the apprentice of the movement, the associate member, and finally the committed member, those engaging in violence, and that is until recently rare, at least in this period, are then of course elevated to the status of mujahid, which is very different. These stages of recruitment are important. They were very much important, and in the period of the boom, in the context later on when the Egyptian state repressed the Muslim Brotherhood greatly, as the rank and file members informed me, they had to shorten this vetting process in order to evade state repression, but also to attract as many as possible young recruits without the burden of this long process of recruitment. The criteria for vetting the recruits also is another aspect of the book that helps us explain the difference between moderate and Islamist members to these organizations. And here I'd like to highlight not only the ideological commitment, and I note here physical strength, which is, believe it or not, extremely important aspect associated with the exercise that the Muslim Brotherhood put their recruit in. But here I'd like, for my purposes today, to really focus on the pre-existing educational social class skills in the labor market. The difference of a number of the Islamist middle class versus the militants in Egypt had to do with the issue of barriers to entry into the organization. For the Muslim Brotherhood al-Akhwan Muslimin in Egypt, it was crucial that there would be a pre-existing educational level that would actually benefit the movement in general. It really recruited in general from the middle classes. Through my interviews, and you'll see in the book, a really meticulous kind of interviewing process in which the skills of potential recruits are measured, evaluated before a full invitation, so to speak, into the movement is actually applied. And this is really important, very different from the recruitment process of the militants in Zimbabwe themselves. I want to then conclude, I know I'm going a little bit over time, to the militant side of the story in Egypt. Here is an example, illustration of one of the informal settlements in Egypt. Not all of them are this debilitated, but it's important to emphasize that these are informal settlements defined as basically housing that is built on former agricultural land that is not regulated by the state, by the Egyptian state. Approximately, as I said, 40% of Egyptians live in these informal settlements. This is just an extreme picture. The majority are actually far more well organized, and they represent lower class, middle class Egyptians from all walks of life, a very heterogeneous, in general, inhabitant population. Recently, I'm not going to belabor this, but I know if those who are Egyptian and of course follow Egypt closely will understand the importance of these informal settlements has come under siege, or let's say rehabilitation, in the context of the present government that in 2018 has promoted the idea, the vision of the end of the slums by 2023, I believe, and now extended. And the idea is to actually do away with these informal settlements through a variety of means, including demolition, in order to rebuild or build new kind of settlements. An interesting resident from these settlements put it, they want the whole island. This is the island of Wara, one of the informal settlements, to create a Manhattan in Cairo. We have contracts, but they will not accept them. We are waiting to see what will happen. There are lots of solutions, such as paying us a fair amount for the land, but it could become violent. The reason I mentioned this contemporary kind of fact is because the book actually looks at the history of the evolution of informal settlements in Western Munira, a part of Imbaba, where these militants actually emerged in the late 1990s. Informal settlements continue to be a central play a central role, not only in terms of economic livelihood, but historically vis-a-vis the state's interest in its own political legitimacy and let's say, the assuring the citizens that they would actually promote their economic livelihood and economic well-being. It continues to be a central political issue, often conflictual one in the Egyptian context. These are the informal settlements. Just to give you a quick picture of why they're so important. In dark blue, these are informal settlements that one of which I did research in, and the blue are in the formal areas. The gray is the city core, Old Cairo, so to speak. This is just by way to show the immense importance of these informal settlements in Egypt. This is Imbaba, a closer shot of where I conducted research that inhabits upwards of 5 to 6 million. It's a large area in Cairo, in the visa government. And this is a closer picture that I wanted to show of Imbaba itself. In the book, very quickly, this is the neighborhood that conducted research, and it's in the southern quarter of it where you see the emergence of more militant organizations. So I'm going to conclude with this slide. What is the reason for the success in this period of these militant organizations? Just to maybe to open it up for questions. A comprehensive strategy was utilized by the militant leaders in this area of Western Munira in Imbaba. And so if you read the last part on Egypt, the last chapter, just keep in mind 4 different important factors that came together to make the militant organization successful. One is the relationship between the informal market and construction and the normative framework of these militant organizations. Another had to do with the long-standing weakening role of traditional leaders in this area that actually disputed settlements before they were basically taken over by Islamist militant organizations, the sermon and the content of the sermon, and the establishment of quote-unquote protection rackets. There's a large discussion of the strongman, the baltagiya, and how militants used a particular element of this strongman as an institution to promote their militant agenda. So I'm going to stop there.